So, members, can I draw your attention? First of all, there was a decision made at the Chairperson's Liaison Group at its last meeting on the 16th. And they made a decision with regard to a pilot programme on the use of electronic devices in committee meetings by journalists and by the public. The rules currently prohibit the use of electronic or mobile devices in committee rooms by the public and the media, but the CLG was informed of a recent review of those rules, including consideration of approach taken in other legislatures. And the result is it's been agreed a pilot is going to run until the end of this mandate, and it will assess the viability of allowing the media and the public to use their electronic devices in the public gallery. There are conditions. It's scary, isn't it? Devices have to be on airplane mode, not on 3 or 4G, and importantly, no recordings or photographs are permitted, which I think includes, in fact I know includes Periscope, because although that's a live transmission, it is also recorded. And a statement to this effect is going to be added to the Chair's brief at the beginning of each meeting. The CLG, perhaps optimistically, do not anticipate problems will occur. However, should members of staff notice or even suspect the device is being used to record or take photographs, they are to bring it to the attention of the Chair, who is then to ask for it to be stopped. And committee staff are to monitor such breaches as part of the pilot. So this will help us decide whether we wish to allow the use of mobiles, etc., in the public gallery. And at the end, there will be recommendations made by the CLG. I don't think it's actually for debate. It's a pilot the CLG have determined to bring forward, but comment is...
No, it's just interesting because maybe it's my phone's different from everybody else, but if I put mine on airplane mode, I can't get Wi-Fi or anything else. So it's kind of strange. What would be the point of having them if they can't? I take it a lot of what journalists might want to do is to tweet or to send emails out or something like that. So
once you go to airplane, you lose the connectivity?
So, yeah, you would lose to be able to go on Facebook or Twitter or anything.
Fatal flaw.
Well, I think, Chair, the important thing is that it's on the Wi-Fi. 3G and 4G must be turned off. Whether that means airplane mode or not, it's too technical for me. Okay. I mean, that's the advice that we were given. But the important thing is that 3 and 4G is turned off because then it won't interfere with recording.
If you're in airplane mode, can you then access the internet by any other means?
Nope. Just done it. You
can't get onto the...
It blocks your
whole
internet connection.
You don't get Wi-Fi, you don't get 3G, 4G, telephone calls, text messages, anything.
That does sound like a flaw in the...
A flaw in the advice, Chair?
In the argument. So we should take that straight back to them then.
You can understand them not wanting to send text messages, obviously, because they could interfere, but people could have... Maybe you're not thinking mobile phones, maybe you're thinking more things like iPads where probably could get Wi-Fi without having any signal if you don't have 3 or 4G on it.
See, the stock message that I am supposed to now deliver to our friends in the public gallery is that you're welcome to use your mobile devices as long as you're in airplane mode and devices are mute, but you're welcome to connect to the Assembly Wi-Fi.
Maybe.
Does that work?
I don't think it does.
No, because it cuts it straight out.
I'm seeing nods of...
No, it doesn't work.
Doesn't work. Can I say I wasn't at the CLG just for the avoidance of doubt? Not that I would have necessarily picked that up. Okay, well, I think we'll report back.
Absolutely.
Thank you, members. We have apologies from Megan Fearon and Chris Little. Any other apologies or late arrivals to note? No. Okay. Page 5 of your packs is where we begin, members. There's an invitation from the Education Authority to a capacity building workshop designed to support groups in the design and provision of e-book summer camps. There's a series of these workshops. Venues and dates are listed on the reply slip, which is at page 8. And please, would you contact the EA directly if you wish to attend. At our meeting on the 10th of February, we noted a request from the Commission for Victims and Survivors to engage with their evaluators who are conducting a review of the strategy for victims and survivors. That's a 10-year strategy which runs to 2019. So we have set up an informal meeting. It's on Tuesday the 8th of March. It's in room 217 and it begins at 1 p.m. and we would ask any member wishing to attend to just let the committee staff know. A list of current invitations is at page 10, just to note. And we move on to the quarterly update from the Office of the Northern Ireland Executive in Brussels. And that's been received in the committee office and will be included in next week's pack. And we would normally issue the update to other statutory committees for information. However, this means there's a slight delay in it being received by other committees. So, members, I'm asking if you're content that the Office of the Executive in Brussels issues the update directly to the other statutory committees at the same time as they issue to other stakeholders. Yes? Thank you. Next, draft minutes. I refer you to draft minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of February, beginning at page 13 of your pack. And the question, as ever, are members content to agree the draft minutes of the meeting of the 17th of February? Thank you. At our meeting last week, we noted correspondence from the Department in response to a request for more information on a range of issues following the briefing on the monitoring rounds and on the budget on the 13th of January. This response, which we did get, did not, however, address the issue of whether the 30 million which has been allocated to dealing with the past can be carried forward if it's not spent in the 16-17 financial year. So committee staff have followed up on the point, and the Department has stated its understanding, which is that if the funding is not spent in the year, it cannot be carried forward for future years. And I understand that 30 million to be part of the 150 million from David Cameron for dealing with the past, which was allocated over a 5-year period. And the Department are clearly saying, what appears to be Treasury saying, spend it, use it or lose it. Also, members of the Department is still to come back to us on a request for a breakdown of budget allocations for the new Executive Office for financial year 16-17.
Is there a letter respect to the former point? Is there a correspondence or an email?
A paper trail?
Through you, Chair, there's an email.
You know, could get copies of it in the packs.
Excuse me, members. The list of outstanding correspondence begins at page 19. And in the absence of comment, we'll go on to correspondence received since we last met. The summary sheet is at page 26. I want to bring to your attention page 60, correspondence from the Department in response to requested information with regard to the Investigating Links in Attainment and Deprivation report. Are members content that we send that to the Committee for Education for their information? Thank you. Page 70, correspondence from the Department in response to requested information regarding the Joint Ministerial Committee Europe. Again, content to forward to the relevant statutory committees for their information. Thank you. Page 73, correspondence from the Committee for Employment and Learning. This is about its report on an inquiry they held into post-special educational need provision in education, employment and training for those with learning disabilities in Northern Ireland. It's embargoed until the commencement of the debate, which is scheduled for plenary on the 1st of March, which is Monday. Yes? Tuesday.
The leap year.
My word. Are members content to forward the report to the Department for comment? Any other matters, members, with regard to correspondence? If not, we go to our draft forward work programme, page 86. Not a lot of time left, members, so not a lot of wriggle room, but if anybody has any suggestions, speak now. We are content with the proposed forward work programme. So, our first briefing, members, we're due to hear from the Commissioner for Children and Young People on ongoing developments in areas of her work. The Clerk's brief is at page 89. The correspondence from the Commissioner with regard to the Child Poverty Strategy is at page 91. And correspondence from the Commissioner with regard to fund mapping is at page 95. And finally, in table papers, a briefing paper was received from the Commissioner yesterday, and that is at page 3. And the Commissioner is Kura Yatsuma, and she joins us with Mairead McCafferty, who is Chief Executive of NICI, the Commission for Children and Young People. So, Mairead, Kula, you're both very welcome.
Thank you,
I
Chair.
have no doubt you have opening remarks.
We absolutely do. So thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to hear from us today. So as the Chair's already said, this is Mairead, and I'm Kula, the Commissioner for Children and Young People. And it's not my intention to go through the paper we sent. I'm sure you've all read it, summarised it, and found the deliberate mistake we made in it. But so just to say, I've been in office nearly a year, and very early on in the process, we identified priority issues that we wanted to progress for children and young people in Northern Ireland, namely child poverty, education, particularly inequalities, mental health and well-being, and of course the embedding of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child in all formal processes concerning children and young people. These aren't the only things we've worked on in the last year. We've worked on a range of other issues, including child sexual exploitation, special educational needs, and others that I'm going to talk to you now that are of direct concern to the committee. First thing I want to say is during the last year we've engaged with over 500 young people directly just to work out, make sure that what we're doing makes a difference and is relevant to their lives. And they confirmed that the priorities we'd identified were the right ones, but they also raised a number of other issues with us, which can be broadly categorised into the areas of safety and respect, particularly young people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, don't feel safe in their communities, don't always feel safe in their families, and particularly don't feel safe at school. The other thing young people raised was the presence and threat of paramilitary-style organisations within particular communities across the religious divide. Young people have also raised bullying as a massive issue, and I know that there's a piece of legislation going through the Assembly at the moment to address that. And again, a consistent theme coming from children and young people is that they feel stereotyped and routinely disrespected by adults around them. Particularly police officers, shopkeepers and bus drivers, would you believe it? One of the big issues that came across from young people that, although we knew but was quite stark when they raised it with us, was the impact of the Troubles. And the impact that the Troubles in Northern Ireland's particular circumstances has routinely on their lives, and as a result the divisions underlying that. I'm not going to go through, we provide quite a lot of evidence in our paper about what we believe the impact of the Troubles has on our children, on rates of poverty, on aspirations for the future and on their mental health. But young people are very clearly saying there's a lot, quite rightly, a lot of discussion and conversations about the legacy of the conflict and moving Northern Ireland forward. They're saying, please involve us in that conversation and discussion. And it's an area of work that it is our intention to work with the Commissioner for Victims and Survivors on. So we'll be doing joint pieces of work as well as working separately on that. When I was before you, when Mairead and I were before you in May of last year, we talked about the review of the NICI legislation, the review of the Commissioner for Children and Young People, Northern Ireland Order 2003. And under Article 24 of that review, there was provision for, under Article 24 of the order, there was provision for a review of the legislation to ensure that that NICI was effective. That was undertaken by my predecessor in 2007 and then again in 2013. I think I said to you in May that as yet we had not received a formal response. That situation hasn't changed today, although we did discuss this with the junior ministers on Monday of this week. My one concern is, as as public sector reform embeds and Nikki is moved to the Department for Communities, that this is going to go to the bottom of that agenda. So I would like it to, if it's not done before this mandate ends, it would be good if it could be moved and be further higher up the agenda and not go at the bottom of the pile. I'm also aware that you will be receiving a briefing from officials with regards to the reporting of the UK government to the UK's performance on the UNCRC. But as you know, Nikki's role is to promote and safeguard the rights of children and young people. And in order to do this effectively, I am required to have regard to the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child. We are in the middle of a reporting period, and it's been quite a busy time for us, where we have been involved with the other four commissioners, the other three commissioners across the water, writing a report on our analysis of children's rights across the UK. We have been, we hosted members of the UN committee coming to Northern Ireland to meet with children and young people, and we hosted that with NGO colleagues. We also went to Geneva to engage in the conversation with them, and I think Northern Ireland acquitted itself very, very well. And the committee last year issued their list of issues, i.e. the questions they want to ask the state and want further information on, and that they will then be examined against that in the May-June session. And it is our intention to go back to Geneva and take part in that process, although we'll not be formally giving evidence to the committee. Ultimately, though, what's really important about this whole UNCRC reporting is the concluding observations and how they frame how we go forward in ensuring the implementation of children's rights in Northern Ireland. And it's our intention in Nikki to make sure that the concluding observations, certainly the high-level ones, are core to our work. Just moving very quickly on to the Children and Young People strategy and the impending programme for government for the next mandate. The Children's Services Cooperation Act that this committee was very involved in sets out the obligations on the executive in relation to children and young people's strategy, highlighting the need to identify clear outcomes and actions across departments and their agencies. The Act also states that children and young people's strategy is to be laid before the Assembly 12 months after the Act received royal assent, which actually brings us to December 2016. Because of the length of time it takes to develop a strategy and an effective one, it's likely that this time frame will not be met. The other thing we want to say about the Children and Young People strategy, which is key, is that it has to be core and it has to be given due weight in the next programme for government. Essentially, we would like to see the high-level outcomes in the Children and Young People strategy, which is also in the Children's Services Cooperation Act, explicitly mentioned in the programme for government, and that the implementation of the strategy in full will be a key priority for this Assembly and the Executive going forward. I now move on to age discrimination legislation. I could have moved on very quickly, but I think you might want me to dwell a little bit on this issue. The committee will be aware of the work that Nikki has been doing in relation to the Office of the First and Deputy First Minister's proposal to bring forward legislation to make it unlawful to discriminate on the grounds of age in accessing goods, facilities and services. We have spoken to you and to a number of others on this issue previously, as has my predecessor. To legislate in a manner which allows children and young people under the age of 16 to continue to experience age discrimination in accessing goods, facilities and services, including vital health services, education, policing and leisure, does not make sense, let alone that it contravenes a number of international and European and local instruments. Article 7 of our legislation outlines the statutory duty that we are under to provide advice to government on matters concerning the rights or best interests of children and young people. Despite this, we do not believe that any of the evidence we have provided to date has been taken cognizance of in progressing proposals for future age GFS legislation. I am aware that at its meeting on the 20th of January, the committee heard from OFMDFM officials and the Equality Commission, and in the course of that evidence, the issue of Nikki taking a formal complaint to ECNI about age GFS consultation was raised. I accept that this is a highly unusual situation, and my understanding is at present ECNI are considering our complaint and hope to have the outcome of that in the coming weeks. In line with their guidance, I'm not sure how much more I can say about that because we're obliged, but I'm happy to take any questions, and where I can answer them and keep within the rules of ECNI, I'd be very happy to do that. In light of the importance of this issue to children and young people, I remain hopeful that we will see the introduction of age GFS legislation in Northern Ireland that includes everyone in its protections. Finally, just very quickly, the Child Poverty Act and Child Poverty Strategy. Child poverty is a huge issue in Northern Ireland, and whichever way you look at the measures, approximately a quarter of our children under the age of 16 live in poverty. And unlike other areas of the UK, those figures are stubbornly persistent. We can see a decline in across the water. We can't see, indeed we see an increase in Northern Ireland. And we know that child poverty is not experienced evenly across Northern Ireland, particularly with inner city wards in Belfast and Derry, and in the west in Strabane area being the most prevalent, the most affected areas. We have some concerns about actions being taken by the Westminster Government to dilute some of the requirements of the 2010 Child Poverty Act, and we would ask that this Assembly gives consideration to not giving consent to any measures that will reduce the impact of the Child Poverty Act, particularly in how some of the numerical measures. The Child Poverty Act requires us to reduce child poverty to 10% and 5%, depending on the measures, by 2020. The one other thing I'd like to say about the Child Poverty Act is it requires each devolved jurisdiction to publish an action plan by March 2014. We are nearly in March 2016, and as yet there has been no action plan published in Northern Ireland. And this is in spite of the Executive's commitment, Target 37 in the programme for government, to fulfil our commitments under the Child Poverty Act and to reduce child poverty. So you can see some of the theme, maybe we're concerned about delays, and we're concerned that children's rights are not being progressed as we would like in Northern Ireland in some areas. That's as much as I have to say formally, and Mairead and I would be very happy to take any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope members agree. I think that was very informative. I want to start with the fundamental legislation, which is the Children and Young People's Northern Ireland Order of 2003, and that makes clear that your primary aim as a commission is to safeguard and promote the rights and the best interests of children and young people. And then at Article 7 there's a little more detail. You are to promote an understanding of the rights of children and young people, promote an awareness of the importance of those rights and a respect amongst children and young people for the rights of others. You have an awareness of matters relating to the best interests. You're to keep under review the adequacy and effectiveness of law and practice as it relates to children and young people. Again, keep under review the adequacy and effectiveness of services. You are to advise Secretary of State, the Executive Committee and any relevant authority on matters you think are relevant, and so on. So I think we're pretty clear about your duties. So can I turn to this so-called Article 24 review? Because, to quote the legislation, it puts duties on you primarily. The Commissioner shall keep under review the work of the Order, make reports on it to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. The first report shall be made as soon as practicable after the 3rd anniversary of the Order. Well, you came in 4 years?
Yeah,
so
2007.
Pretty close. A subsequent report shall be made not earlier than 3 years after the making of the last one. And you can include your views on the adequacy and effectiveness of the Order, and you can make recommendations for amendments to the Order which you think are necessary or desirable. So you have done that twice.
My predecessor did that.
As the Commission?
Yeah, and then I actually reissued it in my name, so there was no doubt that I agreed entirely with what Patricia had done.
Did you add to it?
No.
Okay, so we've had one Article
We've
24
had two.
report
We've had two.
published twice, effectively.
No, we've had two published by Patricia, one in 2007, and then a second one was undertaken in 2013. When I came into office, I read it. There was no reason to recommission and audit it, so I issued it in my name as the new commissioner. So there's been two separate ones done, but almost three issued.
Right.
So
the second
third
one
was
is-
the same as the second.
The second one has been issued twice.
Yes, more or less.
Okay. Give us a flavour of the sort of improvements that children and young people might have enjoyed had your report become accepted.
I think the most fundamental one, which is probably one of the most contentious recommendations, is that, well, there's two. One is that we are given status, what is known as victim status, to enable us to take legal action against any agency that breaches children's rights in the way the Human Rights Commission can do. So if they see a breach of children's rights consistently, what they can do is, with evidence, they can take a case against the state in their own name. The other fundamental one, and there is 12 recommendations, a few of them are tidy up, the others are quite key. But the other fundamental one is there is in Nikki's legislation what is called duplication clauses, which basically says you can't do an investigation if somebody else has the authority to do an investigation, regardless of whether they're minded to or not. We have been advised again and again and again that if, for example, the Public Service Ombudsman, the new public, has in their power to undertake an investigation in a particular way, then we're not allowed to, regardless of whether the new ombudsman is minded to or not. So when essentially it's given us lovely high court powers to undertake investigations, but actually hamstrung us, tied our hands in undertaking such investigations. Our arguments are with proper conversations, memorandum of understanding with other oversight monitoring bodies, we could actually undertake very effective investigations that would quite early on set precedents around improving outcomes and circumstances for children's rights without being a waste of public money. On the victim status, we believe that it would be a really efficient way of ensuring children, instead of taking lots of children taking individual cases on the one issue, we could almost take one class action in our own name, and that would then save private solicitors or other organisations taking cases, and we would do it within the resources we have available to us. So I think we could have actually progressed children's rights quite fundamentally if we'd had those two powers. Bear in mind, you know, there's some other powers, there's some other recommendations which are also fundamental, but they would be my top two.
Okay, let me pursue the first one then, the victim status. So are we saying basically if a young person came to you and said, I have been, let us use the term abused in a broad sense, can you help me? You can if they want to take a case, but if for whatever reason, perhaps they feel so vulnerable they would not be willing,
Yeah.
you cannot take the case on their behalf.
No.
And that's what you would like to do.
No, that's and I think and you've hit the nail on the head. If a family or a young person comes and says, I need this resolved, often it's resolved at the steps of the court, which and we wouldn't argue because they're getting recourse for their own situation. Sometimes it's resolved, they're getting recourse for their own situation. The issue is if it's happening to them, the chances are it's happening to a number of other young people, and you don't get the precedent in the court. So that is the issue, is we don't want to have to put pressure on individuals to go to court. They need to get resolved. So I want to be clear, we do assist them, we absolutely do, we don't abandon them, but we don't get the precedents set in the way that would benefit all children in that situation.
Has it happened that a child or young person has come to you looking for that kind of help and you've been unable to offer it because you don't have victim status and they're not willing or able to act on their own with your support?
We do, and we have submitted further evidence in relation to the Article 24 report detailing occasions when this has happened, so we can resubmit that to the committee if you'd like to have that. In relation to victim status, as the Commissioner said, we can't do that, and we would like to be able to do that because it will benefit, as the Commissioner's already said, greater numbers of young people in terms of protecting their rights as well. We're hamstrung by the duplication clauses in the legislation, because what it actually states is, in one article we're told we can take action, but further down, when you read through the legislation, it actually says, but you can't take that action if there is another authority or public body that can actually take action. So we're hamstrung by that, which is why we want to get the duplication clauses tidied up within the legislation. And there's a number of those actually in terms of the recommendations. There's only 12 recommendations in total. Victim status is probably, as the Commissioner's already said, the most important one. One of the other very important ones as well is recommendation 11, which relates to Paris Principles compliance, and that relates to the role fundamentally of NICI per se, because this talks about the standing of the office in terms of it being an independent human rights institution. And what is very important in that, and in a sense it's the last piece of the jigsaw, and I think we said this last time we were here, that this organisation and the Commissioner, who is the body corporate, should be accountable to the Northern Ireland Assembly and not just one government department, which is one of the recommendations that was put forward back in 2007 and again in 2013. And in doing that, and in being that and being granted that, you'd be able to protect children's rights much more effectively and efficiently, particularly when we look at having to have regard to the UNCRC, one of the international covenants that the UK State Party has already signed up to. So I think that's one of the things that we would like to see moved on as well. As the Commissioner's already said, we brought this up with the junior ministers on Monday, and we're to have further meetings around it. But to date, obviously, we haven't received a comprehensive formal response in relation to the 12 recommendations that were put forward in the report.
Can you
Or
tell
any
us?
formal response.
Right. Can you say any more about your meeting on Monday, or do you consider that best left confidential as it is an ongoing process?
Well, yeah, it's going to be an ongoing process, so there's not much more we can tell as well. We did receive one letter in January just in relation to victim status, but we had issues with the letter because there seemed to be a misunderstanding in relation to the role of NICI, and that's something we've already raised and will be addressing again.
And to get back to the fact that there have been 3 of these Article 24 reports, although number 3 is number 2.
Two reviews in an Article 24 report, yeah.
Are they in the public domain?
Yes, they are. Yeah, they're available on the website, and we can. I think we've shared the book. We're happy to share them. And as Mairead says, one of them does include actual examples of where we've had differences we could have made if we'd had victim status.
So OFMDFM have complied with their obligation to lay copies of the report before the Assembly?
I don't think they've laid. I'm not sure whether. I don't think they've laid copies of the Article 24 report.
But can I draw your attention to Article 24(5) in the 2003 order? First Minister and Deputy First Minister, acting jointly, shall lay a copy of every report sent to them under this article before the Assembly. Is it your suspicion that they're in breach of the law?
I have no. It's all right. I'm not. I don't even try and put words in my mouth. I cannot
Is it
confirm.
your suspicion?
I have no evidence.
I am not trying to
either
put
one
words
way
in
or
your
another.
mouth.
I don't. I have no evidence one way or another. And I think. Do you? You've been around. We don't. I'm not aware. I'm not aware.
Rephrase the question. Are you aware whether...
Not aware that either of the Article 24 reports, either 2007 2013, has been formally laid before the Assembly. I'm not aware of that. No.
Okay, thank you.
Fair enough?
Yeah, I think we'll clarify.
My legal advisor was keeping me right.
That's fine. I was not trying to put words in your mouth. I was seeking clarification. Chris Hazard.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for that. Perhaps we could turn maybe just to the UNCRC and to what extent that actually can change things here. Perhaps speaking with my education hat on, I know, for example, I'm very critical around academic selection, but not as if it changes anything. So what weight can it actually bring, and does it bring, and maybe what's your hopes or expectations out of this process you're involved in?
I think that's a really helpful question, because that is exactly why we're in the job. We're in the job to give effect to children's rights in Northern Ireland, for the children of Northern Ireland, and having a children's commissioner or a children's ombudsman is recommended by the UN as an implementation mechanism for children's rights. So we do what you would hope is that we would then be able to give very clear advice to to our government with regards to the implementation of the UNCRC. As you know, it's being interpreted differently as to whether it has the same status as a domestic law, and it's not. But and I did say that the concluding observations are key and will certainly drive forward our work. The fact that we're likely to get another concluding observation, which is probably the third, on academic selection and the need for it to be abolished, and we're not significantly further forward, begs the question about how effective can a body like NICI be, which is why the Article 24 review is really, really important to ensure that our effectiveness is as much as it can be. What I'll say to you, Chris, is that I actually really think that there's nobody who works in children's issues in Northern Ireland that doesn't want to do what's right for children. Yeah. And we need to just work out, have a consensus about what that is. And particularly as we move into a new political mandate, I think it's now time that we look at the evidence and that we're honest as a society about what does the evidence tell us is in the best interest of our children, and let's act on that, setting aside whatever vested interests we may have. Academic selection, education inequality generally is big. Academic selection is one of those pillars. I'm on record as saying I think it should, we should remove it, and that we shouldn't select children at the age of 11. The issue that parents particularly have raised with us is, well, what's the alternative? And that's the conversation. Before we remove selection and these are the unregulated tests that we have at the moment, we need to be clear what will an education system look like. And the other thing that we've argued for is the one conversation. There's lots of conversations having, which are really, really very vibrant, but we need to have one consistent conversation about education for our children and a number of other issues. So I don't think I answered that question, because but I'm hopeful the UNCRC should be the framework that drives everything we do for our children. It's not out here and it's not up there. It should surround us.
Thanks. And I suppose that's what I was getting to, is nearly providing yourselves with the teeth
yes.
able to deliver.
Which is why the Article 24 review is so important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a timeline when that's due to finish, is it?
Well, the thing is, we're still waiting.
Okay.
We're still waiting.
One of the things I suppose that's pertinent, just in relation to your question, Chris, as well, is the Children's Service Corporation Act does reference the UNCRC. Yeah. And increasingly we're saying that legislation is coming through that does reference the UNCRC. So while it's not, in a sense, domestically enforceable, it is certainly being used increasingly more and more. Even judges and courts now are referring to it more and more as well in terms of good practice. When we're looking at the next Children and Young People strategy that Kuil has already mentioned, it will be the case that we will want to make sure that the rights of children and young people, as they are manifested in terms of the actions that have to happen in terms of the strategy, should be referenced in the UNCRC as well. Because at the end of the day, this is going to help the executive next time round when we have to report to the UN committee. So it makes sense to try and get things right from the outset and use the best international standards to measure those against as well. So hopefully that's
okay. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
So on the list of issues, as they call it, with the UNCRC, is there anything that you think is unique to Northern Ireland?
For Northern Ireland? Academic selection is in there, the legacy of the conflict and the impact that has on our children and young people. Age GFS, it does mention it only in relation to that we're going from 16s. Also talks about mental health and in connection to the legacy. I have actually the list of issues with me. The list of issues that they raise talks about making sure the commissioners are Paris Principles compliant. It mentions in Northern Ireland the lack of a youth assembly. So it does talk about Northern Ireland, like I said, the lack of a youth assembly. It does talk about sexuality and relationship education. Now, it does talk about all education settings, but I do think there is a particular issue for Northern Ireland in relation to that. So it raises a number of other issues, like the minimum age criminal responsibilities, migrant children, but they're the ones that specifically mention Northern Ireland. I will say Northern Ireland gets more mentions than any other jurisdiction, even though we're the smallest in the UK. Which is what I meant when I said we acquitted ourselves very well when we were in Geneva.
Okay. But ultimately, there is a UN submission
Sorry?
There's a UK submission
Yes.
to
Yes.
the UN, and the executive inputs to
Into the UK
submission.
submission, yes.
And you input to the executives.
No,
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 unfortunately.
we produce there is a state party report, and then there's a series of what they call alternative
So
reports.
you're
The 4 commissioners have submitted a UK-wide initial report, and we're about to submit a response to, once the UK government issue their response to the list of issues, we will then submit a response to that.
Have you seen the executive's input to the UK submission?
Not formally, no.
So you cannot respond yet?
Not yet. We will respond once it's published. It's due to be formally published, formally submitted next week, and then we have 6 weeks in which to respond to it.
Child poverty stats. You frighten us. You say we're going to go from low 20s to very, very high 20s?
We suspect some research that was done says if we continue on the trajectory that we're on, and we've yet to factor in the full effect of welfare reform, although we've got the mitigation measures for Northern Ireland, is that it will increase. That is in the absence of a child poverty action plan.
And this is absolute child poverty. Could hit 29%.
Yeah.
What could we do?
I think there's a range of things we can do. We can do things, and the government have already talked about a living wage, and Northern Ireland has a particularly low wage economy, so we can talk about a good living wage, bearing in mind that so many children live in families where one or both parents work. We can also ensure that we have proper childcare to facilitate parents being able to go to work confident that their children are being cared for in a high quality way. There are other things we can do which are around capacity building of our children and our families. One of which is one of the ones we're thinking about is about making education poverty free. Now, we do have Article 20 talks about free education, and of course we do not have to pay for our children to go to school, but often once they get through the door, those of us who are parents do get constant reminders to pay this, pay that, pay the other, you know, whether it's uniform, and being on free school meals and getting some of those additional grants doesn't always pay for that, or inhibits children accessing things like certain school trips. So many children go on ski trips this time of year. Poorer children aren't able to fully participate in the life of a school, whether it's music tuition, extracurricular, and any of those. So there are things like that we can do. There are there's health care issues that we can do as well. There's having warm homes, making sure that all the homes, particularly those provided in social housing, are, you know, that they're not letting out heat and that they've got efficient fuel systems. Fuel poverty is huge in Northern Ireland. There are a few. Is there any? There's loads, but is there? So that we can do things. We can do things.
Well, let me ask, and maybe Mairead, do you want to
Yeah.
pick this up? As we're going to allegedly an outcome-based programme for government, Bill is listing a number of outcomes there. Have you inputted all these already?
Yes, I mean, we are actually on the project board of the Developing Children and Young People Strategy, and we've also had meetings with officials around the developing programme for government, because the outcomes and the actions to achieve those outcomes are what is going to make the difference to the lives of children and young people as well as everyone else across Northern Ireland. So we're very keen to make sure that we get this right. There is an opportunity here with both of these strategies and the programme for government converging. So there is an opportunity here to get it right. There are a number of other systemic things, I think, that, and Cialla's already touched on some of those, that would make a difference in relation to levels of child poverty here. And we are aware, for example, the Education Minister did campaign and pushed for free school meal entitlement to be taken up. We know that's not at 100% yet. We're also aware, having listened to parents and children themselves, that sometimes there's a stigma attached to claiming free school meals. Different systems operate in different schools. We have already addressed this with the likes of the Department of Education and the Education Authority. So we're hoping that they're going to be taking on board the recommendations that we've made in relation to that. But there are things that need to be done, because increasingly, and we have seen this, we are creating, and we've said this before, certainly in previous evidence, we are creating a class of working poor. We do have 50% of our children who are living in poverty who belong to families where there is at least one parent working. That then screams that we need to have a living wage. We need to have wages that will reflect the cost of living much more effectively, because we need to lift our children out of poverty. And I know that that's obviously Cool has already referenced some of the actions that could be done, but we will be making sure when we're looking at the outcomes that you refer to make sure that that is what is going to make the difference. And the most important thing in all of this, like the programme for government and like the strategy itself, we have to monitor this effectively and make sure that we review on an ongoing basis if something is not having the impact that we want it to have.
I mean, so all the issues we've talked about are those that research tells us will make a difference. They've not come from Nikki, and it will be what we will be doing is monitoring and making sure that government are doing the right things to achieve the outcomes that they've said they're going to achieve.
Now, let me emphasise again, when I mentioned the 29% projection, that was the absolute, and that's of course one of 4 measures. You're keen to keep the 4 measures?
Yes.
And have lobbied or corresponded with Floyd on that?
We have.
Have you had a response?
Well, what we know is the House of Lords have thwarted, rejected the Commons' attempt to remove the numerical measures. And Lord Floyd was leading on that. So we've had an early win. Those of us, and it's not just the Children's Commissioners, those of us who are keen that we keep the measures under the Child Poverty Act of 2010. So we're waiting to see what the Commons will do next.
You've touched on age discrimination on goods, facilities and services. Can I ask you in specific about your concerns about the consultation? Because I will try and put words in your mouth this time. Maybe you felt the consultation did not make it easy to change the intent to exclude under 16.
The issue with age discrimination legislation is that this has been on the Assembly and the Executive's agenda this whole mandate. And the programme for government makes it clear that it will introduce age discrimination legislation. About 2 or 3 years ago, it's always, you can never find it when you're looking for it, can you? It talks about developing and consulting in 2012-13 and progressing legislation in 13-14 and passing the legislation in the 14-15 year. What happened in 2012 when this was first mooted? Nikki, along with the Equality Commission and a number of other actors in the voluntary and community sector, argued vociferously and robustly and quite convincingly that age discrimination legislation should cover all children. That was in 2012, and 2013 is when a lot of the activity. Therefore, it was quite bizarre that in February of last year, OFMDFM announced that they would be introducing a consultation, but they were not minded to extend to under 16s these protections. And it felt, and I was just incoming as Commissioner there, and it felt like none of the work that had been undertaken by the Equality Commission and by Nikki had been taken account of. It felt like it had been just dismissed. We're not minded to, seem to be. So you're right. The way that the question was phrased in the consultation document led us to believe that it wasn't genuine and had not taken into account all the evidence that they had been, what was very compelling evidence that they had been given in the subsequent 2 years. So this didn't suddenly appear in February of last year. The consultation came out in the summer of last year and closed early autumn. And we were concerned, particularly as accelerated passage was mentioned both both to you in formal evidence, but also in order, as to how it would meet a commitment to programme for government and be completed in this mandate. So we were concerned that the consultation was not a genuine consultation. I need to be very clear, I think, and you've heard from the officials about this, sometimes I do think, officials and civil servants are at their work. In this case, they've made it clear that these are political decisions, and the officials, and I'm not just saying that because they're sat behind me, the officials have engaged with us as far as they have been able to on this issue. All we have asked, and again have reiterated this with DFM, with the Deputy First Minister and the 2 junior ministers, I would like them to respond to us and others who have said this is why you should include, and given them the compelling reasons. I would like them to tell us why we're wrong. That's all I need. It's my job in the legislation to give advice. I would love it if it was in the legislation government had to take my advice, but I would appreciate the courtesy of them telling me why they're not taking my advice, since they've set me up to give them advice. So I would just like somebody to tell me why the advice I'm giving them is not going to be followed. That's as much as we can ask. Well, I'd like them to follow it, but I don't live in cloud cuckoo land. They have other considerations, but we just need to know why they're not minded to extend to under 16s.
Well, I think Alex Atwood wants to come in at this point.
Well, first of all, acknowledge that it's always good to hear a refreshing frankness from those who are given evidence. And you become more frank as the last half an hour.
I think you know me, Alex. The frankness was always what you were going to get.
By 4 o'clock, we should be in some very interesting space.
Fortunately, we're going to be out of here soon.
I think you'll find.
Hopefully, we'll be out of here soon.
The reason why I say that actually is that one of the most refreshingly frank moments in the life of this committee was in the autumn of 2014, when the then Victims Commissioner came and advised the committee why she had formally alerted, those were her words, OFMDFM in relation to the VSS. And that was her way of giving advice to OFMDFM, given the catastrophic state of VSS at that time. And between OFMDFM, the officials, people in the VSS and this committee, and most of all the victims themselves, that was able to be turned. Given the catastrophic state of affairs that we now face in respect to child poverty, where the figures from FMDFM indicate that the relevant absolute figures might be over 30 and close to 35
in the future,
by 2020. And given that the IFS says that a significant reason for increased child poverty is the welfare changes, that was their formal advice issued in relation to the current legislation going through Westminster, the social security provisions of which we have now signed up to. And given all of that, and the fact that the judgment last July confirmed that there wasn't an anti-poverty strategy, and given that you've been now frustrated in being given answers to the advice that you're given, is there any provision for you to formally alert FM and DFM in relation to the catastrophic state of affairs that we're now facing in respect to child poverty?
I think we have. I mean, in view of the fact that these are OFM, DFM's own figures, I think we have done as much as it's possible for us to do and to say, where is your child poverty action plan? We have engaged with them as much as we can. It goes back to our powers and how much we can do. We have alerted. They know the figures. They know that they need an action plan. We are working with them quite closely around the Children and Young People strategy, which one would hope will have an impact. Well, one assumes will have an impact on outcomes, including child poverty for our children and young people. Consistently, we have talked about the impact of welfare reform. You know, I have been pleased to see that the mitigation measures have talked specifically and are aimed specifically at families. You know, the economic situation of Northern Ireland has a direct impact on families. We know all that. We have done as much. I'm not sure how much more we could have done to alert them on a number of issues, of which this is one.
I mean, Nikki did actually, and you'll be aware of this, produce 2 reports when welfare reform was initially proposed. And one of those was looking at the impact in relation to children and young people. Obviously not the direct recipients of benefits, but obviously going to be impacted by them. And we also did another report at the same time around parity, in terms of breaking parity with the rest of the UK in relation to some of the measures that would have to be applied in Northern Ireland. Obviously time has moved on. This is an issue that is very, very fundamental to the role of the Children's Commissioner and is on the agenda of every single meeting we have, not just with officials but with ministers as well, and certainly when we've been engaging with the ministers and MLAs as well, including yourself as well, Alex. So it is something that is very much in there. We have also written, as Cool has already said, in relation to the legislative consent that would be required in relation to the Welfare Reform and Work Act, saying that we don't think, and we would hope not, that's given here, because we do believe that the 4 measurements that the Chair has already referred to are retained very much, because we do have a unique situation in Northern Ireland in relation to levels of child poverty, and some of the figures, as you say, are not just alarming but I think an indictment.
The LCM has been passed in relation to the Welfare Reform and Work Bill, but the Minister advised that that was a social security provision.
Yeah.
And he said that they were not, the LCM did not capture the
BPI.
poverty,
No.
or whatever word Cameron is now calling poverty.
Yeah, no,
Life
no,
opportunities is now
That's
referred
it, yeah.
whatever.
Lifetime opportunities.
Lifetime opportunities is now the
Sounds like a
Tory word
course.
for poverty. Can I ask you a second question? There was an encouraging sign yesterday at a meeting here when a senior official in OFMDFM was speaking at a community health manifesto launch. And that official is one of the lead officials in respect to the programme for government. So it was encouraging to see a senior PFG official actually speaking at a manifesto launch in terms of community health interventions to deal with the health issue. And that is all about joined up government, because you have to deal with housing, you have to deal with poverty, you have to deal with childcare, you have to deal with the whole thing. And you seem to corroborate that by some sense of greater involvement by you in the PFG. Could you just elaborate on that to see whether it is happening in a qualitative way as opposed to a notional way?
Because you've been leading for some PFG.
Yeah, obviously, because just in relation to where we're at in relation to the development of the programme for government, and we have been engaging with officials around that, and certainly talking to the permanent secretaries as well, because we understand that obviously that everybody has a role to play in relation to that. Where we are at the minute is in looking at how the children and young people strategy and the outcomes for that will be read across into the programme for government so that these aren't lost. And I suppose that's where we're at as far as that's concerned. We are mindful that there are competing priorities depending on which sector and which area of work you're involved in. But we want to make sure that certainly when we're looking at things like child poverty and mental health for that matter, that we are making sure we capture that in the children and young people strategy, obviously as it relates to children and young people, but also that that's right across into the programme for government. And we will be engaging further with the officials who are leading on the programme for government as well.
Do we think that there is more cross-departmental work around PFG? Yes, we do. We have the Children's Services Corporation Bill, which should facilitate that. You know, I think, you know, in another room in this very building, the Committee for Education is looking at the education commitments under the programme for government, the current one, and whether they've been met. you know, they will be found in some cases not to have been met. I do think with officials, I see a greater determination to actually make the programme for government something that we can achieve. And what we're saying is we expect our children to be in the middle of all of that and have a social, not just an economic based programme for government. It needs to be the both together.
Middle and left and right of all of that.
Yeah,
because,
absolutely.
You know, given the scale of the poverty figures alone and all the other indicators, if that's not at the heart of everything.
And the children want to be involved in all this, in those conversations.
But I'm hoping that it is not notional, that because of the Agnew Bill and because of an outcomes-based approach to the PFG, it's actually going to become part of the core architecture. Absolutely. It'll only become part of the core architecture, in my view, when the specialists like you are actually embedded in government, because I don't believe that government has the lateral ability to move from here to there. It needs the external specialists, whether it's business or environment or children's or embedded in the life of government. Because there's very good officials, but they are, especially at a senior management level, risk averse, conservative, institutional, with a bit of the legacy of direct rule until you're in. And that's not necessarily reference anybody here or elsewhere, but certainly was my experience. But then actually the last question is, which struck me about the children and the legacy of violence, and as you know, according to the British Secretary of State, we're very close to some outcome in terms of the past, and is there the kind of thing that you think that the parties and the governments need to know that is missing? I think there's a lot missing, but something that is particularly missing around the legacy of the past and our young people and children that doesn't seem to be captured in the ongoing discussions and negotiations?
The big issue, and it was highlighted by the Commission for Victims and Survivors, is the impact of intergenerational, transgenerational trauma. Yeah. And that our children and young people, most of whom were born, this has been a line of ours for quite some months now, but children and young people, most of whom were born after the ceasefires and the Good Friday Agreement, are living the impact of a conflict that's supposed to have ended before they were born. It's really, really important. This idea, I looked up an article that talked about the children of the conflict, and it, with all due respect to all of it, talked about you. It didn't talk about the children, our children today. They are also living the impact of the conflict, particularly children in certain communities. And what we're not seeing enough of is that dimension. And I know the trauma service that's been announced, there is some discussion around family trauma, but young people are experiencing trauma because they are being impacted on. The other thing is, I mentioned it, and we mention it more in the paper, is children today, young people today, from both communities across this jurisdiction, are speaking about paramilitary involvement in their lives, either to assault or exclude them from their communities for alleged behaviour, to control how they use their public spaces, to sell drugs to them, or to recruit them in lieu of drugs. That's what children and young people are telling us in the here and now. Now, we are about to engage with the panel on distant paramilitary organisations. So, but they're two of the big things that children and young people are saying to us in the here and now. The other thing is that they are very, very frustrated that they're not part of these conversations that is being had. And I think we need to be careful how we involve children and young people in some of these conversations, because they are of a particular type, and some of it is, but please, they are pleading that people talk to them as this begins to roll out. As a group of kids reminded me at the weekend, you're talking about the future, it's your present, it's our future. Now, I went home feeling very old after that, but it is right, we're making decisions, or people are making decisions now for something that the next generation are going to live. Some of them are up for that conversation. But those two things are two of the key things that they want to talk about.
Alex Maskey.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Gillian Mairead, for your presentation so far. I think you made a wee point earlier on. I don't think you really meant it, but you're saying words the effect of because some of the UN's CRC recommendations weren't been enshrined or weren't been put into effect, calling the question role of it.
No, it doesn't call into question. No, I absolutely didn't mean that.
To say that because
makes it even more important.
It makes it more important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do think it means that organisations and commissioners like your own have to be increasingly more and more robust to make it a proper impact. And that it does mean that we have to be frank and more robust as we go along, because there are a couple of things there I would draw attention to. And for me, it is about increasingly accelerating or moving further to making the point or putting responsibility where it might lie. So I think, for example, when you talk about giving a couple of examples there, like academic selection, where you're making the point that, yeah, it's a bad thing, it should be done away with, but you really need to have a conversation about what you need to have in its place. Well, that's true, but then also that if people had waited until there was an agreement, then you still would not have any decision taken on that. So I think people need to start moving to a point where you start to call things out, really, in as constructive a political and civic way as at all possible, because you have to try and build relationships and change minds and change policies. Likewise with the GFS, I don't know, can't speak for yourselves talking to the DFM, looking for a rationale for excluding under 16 years of age. I presume you wouldn't get a response from that because it's joint office. But having met our party, you would know that our party doesn't agree with excluding under 16 years of age. So if you've written to Martin McGuinness, he'll quite easily tell you that, as we have said on the record, which is why we argue for a question in the consultation. We've invited people to give us the response that they don't like it. On that basis, I think people have had to have a rethink, which I'm glad. But we need to move into a new mandate to make sure that people then put on the table the need to provide that legal protection for everybody.
Absolutely.
And I think it was disappointing that other commissioners actually, in the middle of all that, were prepared to say, well, we agree that everybody should be included, but if you can't include theirs, at least include ours. Yeah, that was breaking ranks.
Well, doing their job.
So that's fair enough, but in the broader civic side, I'm not so sure that is the case. I'm just making a point that people do need to be, we do need to be kind of frank and honest and robust, whatever the issues that we're trying to deal with. I'm looking for some kind of comparable or some kind of qualitative examination of the kind of statistics, because when we talk about child poverty, for example, and bear in mind I'm an elected representative, I deal with families every day in a week. I have a family of my own, so I know what I'm talking about. So what concerns me a wee bit is when we use figures, there doesn't appear to be any kind of comparison. When people talk about levels of poverty, I'm an elected representative for 30 odd years. There's no comparison, for the most part, on the day-to-day living conditions of families. There just isn't. I mean, in the area where I live, I could bring you the photographs, you don't need to, but just making the point that the life conditions and hopes and expectations of people back 30 years ago are incomparable, for the most part, thankfully, than where they are today. Statistically, they may be one way or another, but you can't compare lifestyles and life conditions. So when people use figures, I think there needs to be some qualitative understanding of that, so as that we can actually drill down and tackle the problems. And rightly so, you've identified a range of issues which lead to child poverty and other wider poverties, because, and I mean, we did a good bit of work with all the committees around fuel poverty some time ago, and there's so kind of a whole range of issues which impact on fuel poverty. And I actually come to the view in my own mind that when we talk about fuel poverty or child poverty, at the end of the day, it's still poverty. So I think sometimes I would somewhere along the line love to get myself back to a point where we're saying let's deal with poverty across the board, or the impact of low income, because we all understand that. But I just think sometimes we just put layers and layers and layers of problems, and maybe we're not identifying the right thing. So I'm just sort of looking at some kind of qualitative analysis of some of the figures. And that's not to suggest for 1 second that there aren't major problems out there. There are major problems out there, which is why we had these institutions virtually on the point of collapse just a few weeks ago, really, when you consider over things like welfare reform, which is why this executive has £500 million on the table out of the black grant, because we couldn't get any more out of London. But so people are trying to do their best to tackle these things. But I just would like to have some kind of comparable or qualitative analysis rather than just figures, because I think once you get beyond the figures, then you can probably more easily identify solutions, if you know what I mean. So that's the kind of my broad thinking on that. But essentially, I would see the role for your commission and others as absolutely essential in the time ahead, because you need to be more and more robust, but calling it as it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is our intention to be far clearer and emphatic in what we say and when we say it, and that if we speak with an authoritative voice. Just very, very quickly on the poverty, we have been working and talking amongst ourselves, but also working with a number of others around how we can make the reality of child poverty better understood, which is the qualitative stuff. I think people think of child poverty and they think in places like Africa and Asia, and we need to remember in the here and now there are people who can't heat their homes, can't afford the 3 square meals, and we need to make that better understood. Yes. And that's some of the conversations we've been having. So I suppose the thing to say, absolutely agree with you, and watch this space.
Could I just ask, Chair, just one wee point? I mean, in terms of this duplication issue, which is, I think it's important, we'd like to explore that a wee bit further. Are there any examples that you can give that there were investigations that you want to take? I'm not even necessarily talking about an individual case, but you know, if there were generic problems that you were identifying that you were not able to take because of this duplication provision, but that nobody else was actually undertaken anyway, if you know what I mean? Because that would be very worrying if that was the case.
I mean, the first thing that springs to mind actually when you're speaking there, Alex, was, I mean, around the time that child sexual exploitation was hitting the headlines, and Nick had already been involved in a series of roundtables with various stakeholders, statutory agencies, in relation to this. And we were actually asked by a minister, why was Nicky not doing an inquiry and an investigation into this, but we couldn't do it, because our Article 13, I think it's Article 13, and the legislation prohibits us doing that if there's another public authority that could do it. In relation to individual, in terms of the duplication clauses, we do have a number of example and sample cases, and again we can send that paper up to you. I just can't quote them.
That would be helpful.
But we will get them up to you, because we did do an
Yeah.
additional paper just in support of the Article 24 recommendations as well.
Oh, thank you.
Be more efficient way of doing it as well.
Yeah.
Oh, no, thanks for that. That's very helpful.
Okay, thank you. A couple more things, maybe just to note at this stage, the fund mapping report numbers, which is a page...
Don't ask us too many questions about that, it's very complicated, but yes, no, go for it.
No, I wasn't going to, but now you've mentioned it...
No, go on. No, we both read
after
it.
4 o'clock
We
here.
both read it. No, go for it.
No, so this is a map of the investment of public resources in the well-being of children and young people in Northern Ireland. So I think it is to note, members.
It is.
It's quite
And
unique.
it's a baseline, and with the Children's Cooperation Act,
Absolutely.
this is
huge.
very timely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As a baseline. Department of Education, of course, is up at over 70%. Anybody you think not pulling their weight?
I think it's not so much that whether people are pulling their weight or not. It's it is a baseline, and it's unique on these islands as a piece of work that's been done. So we are very proud of it, and it's because it's all about economists that I was joking about not asking us. What came out quite significantly in that report, and we're teasing out a little bit more, is that all this money is being spent on children and young people, but not much of it. Do we know what the outcomes are? Whether they can talk about some projects that they're funding external to government in the NGO sector that are properly evaluated and the outcomes are measured, but that they, when they spend all this money, government isn't able to say this is what we're getting back, and that is one of the conversations that needs to happen. particularly in straitened times, are we getting the best value for money? So it's not whether people are pulling their weight or not, because there's still quite a lot of work to do to understand how much councils are paying, you know, the other tiers of government. We don't know whether we're getting the best value for our money and whether children are being having the best outcomes for the money that we are spending. And until we know that, then we can't be confident what more we need to have. So it's a really great piece of work that we're taking forward in a cross-sectoral way.
Okay. My final point is with regard to the transfer functions. You've made clear your concerns about going to the Department of Community, and that's fine. I just want on the record, do you believe that being sponsored by OFMDFM, Department of Community, is not compliant with the Paris Principles?
It's absolutely not compliant with the Paris Principles, and we believe we should be a body, as in accordance with Paris Principles, of the Assembly, which is the UN Committee have asked that of the 3 commissioners who are not bodies of their legislature. We believe we should be given the same consideration as NIPSO will be once they're up and running.
And do you attach any weight to the fact that this committee has just done that with NIPSO?
We think it shines the light, and I think we will give NIPSO a chance to embed, and then we will go around and say, you've done it with them, you need to do it with us. We're interested to see what the UK government will respond to that question, but absolutely has to happen.
Anne-Marie, thank you both.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And good luck if you are with communities. You might not be in front of the successor committee of OFMDFM.
Look forward to it.
Okay. Members, there's just one matter we might want to pick up with the department is to ask for clarity about whether those reports under Article 24.5 of the 2003 order have been laid in front of the Assembly, unless the officials who are about to give evidence can answer it, which they may or may not be able to do. But if they are not able, shall we write and just ask? Okay, so departmental officials are next on the input into the UK Government's response to that UNCRC list of issues. The clerk's brief for this one is page 217. A letter from OFMDFM on the list is 218. A letter on the child poverty strategy is in table papers. That is on page 11. There is no briefing paper from the department, but there are 3 officials: Margaret Rose McNaughton, who is the Director of Equality, Human Rights and Social Change, June Wilkinson, and Christine Smith. Margaret Rose, can you answer that question about the Article 24 reports? Have they been laid before the Assembly? Do you know?
I don't know for absolute certainty,
we'll
but
write
I
to you
don't.
on it.
We'll write.
Right.
Don't mind.
Okay.
Okay.
Opening remarks, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity to brief the committee on our process for engaging in the UNCRC reporting cycle. I'll introduce June Wilkinson, Head of Children and Young People's Unit, and Christine Smith from the unit, who are both with me today. The committee will already have received the list of issues which we provided in December 2015. And if you're content, I'll just give you a quick background to the approach that we've adopted. You will know that the UNCRC was ratified in 1991. Under the Convention, the UK, as a state party, must submit periodic reports every 5 years. And the Department for Education in England leads in this process with input from the other 3 jurisdictions and overseas territories, and is responsible for the final report that issues to the UN Committee. The main task of the committee is to review the reports submitted by state parties, and the committee holds constructive dialogue with each state so it can make an accurate assessment of the child rights situation in that country and make recommendations to the state to fulfil its obligations and advance child rights. Each new reporting cycle begins when the committee receives a state party report, and then the review will end, as Kula, I think, said, with the UN producing a set of concluding observations. So in this cycle, the UK state party report was submitted to the UN committee in May 2014, and it's scheduled to be examined by the committee in May 2016. And broadly speaking, the UK report was well received by the UN committee. Progress through policies and legislation was acknowledged, as was key areas identified that the committee felt lacked momentum. The UN Committee have since met with civil society organisations and children and young people who outlined their main concerns about children's rights, and they will also have received the alternative reports from Nikki and from other NGOs. So that's the stage in the reporting cycle that we're at now. A formal report back on the list of issues and preparation for an oral examination in May 2016, which will provide us with an opportunity to go into more detail on the work that we're progressing as an executive to deliver on the issues, on the list of issues, and help to alleviate some of the concerns, hopefully, that the committee may have in terms of progress. I'm going to hand over to June now, who will give committee members an update on how we engaged with the sector in developing our input to the UK.
Thank you, Margaret Rose. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak in front of you today. I've been in my post 2 years, and really engaging with a very wide range of stakeholders on an ongoing basis to achieve improvements in children's rights is fundamental to my role. In order to provide a response that's fully reflective of the position in child rights in Northern Ireland, my unit engaged in a wide number of ways. We examined in detail the Commissioner's report to the UN, the Human Rights Commission report to the UN, and the NGO alternative report to the UN, which were all published in the summer. Most importantly, we reviewed in detail the Young Persons report that they produced themselves through the NGOs, Our Life in Our Words, and it's very stark, very vivid in terms of what they're saying to us. We shared those reports with the departments, drawing their attention to the recommendations that those bodies had made in the reports. We met with the departments then on the list of issues when they came out loud. We then went on, as you know, the list of issues came out mid-November, where we advertised widely on CYPSP website, on the Delivering Social Change monthly update, and through CINE, who have been very helpful, seeking people's views on the matter. We went on to organise a workshop in December where NGOs came along to express their views and give us their opinion on how things have went on the list of issues. We took a note of that meeting and we shared those comments back to back to departments, so that the departments were as informed as possible on the views of the stakeholders and the young people themselves on those issues. And of course, Nikki, ongoing dialogue with Nikki on those issues. It was a web page. As well as formal stakeholder engagement, which we did then to contribute to the report, we've used all the vehicles available to us to ensure discussions on children's rights continue to be improved through the work of the public sector. And what I'm trying to explain here is how everything I do is linked together. Very much listening to the voice of the young people themselves, their key concerns, their priorities. That's why I refer particularly to their report during the summer. Engaging with them, attending events that organisations hold where we can meet young people. The Long Gallery, you would have been at events like that yourself. Reading reports, and since I have started work on developing the new strategy, I have received numerous feedback from organisations engaged with young people, providing me with young people's views. So very much trying to catch up with what the young people have already said, not starting with a clean sheet and saying, so what would you like to consult with you on? Listening already to what they've said and drawing it in. The main discussions last year, which was a big part of my work on the Children's Services Corporation Act, was very useful in providing vehicles for identifying and drawing out issues, the views of the sector, the views of the Commissioner, views of yourselves in the concerns and why that act was necessary was very informative for me. And really, the development of the new strategy itself is, as Maria has explained, utilising the UNCRC as a framework for how it's structured. The discussions around how we develop the strategy, how we develop the outcomes, are framed around young people's rights. And most importantly, I would hope that an element of that strategy will include reference to the next concluding observations, because this is about tying it all together. The concluding observations aren't separate to the strategy. They're the key document how Northern Ireland should be working towards delivering for its children and young people through its new national plan, which we would hope would be the strategy to make their lives better. And that's how we can be held to account for that. Hopefully the Act tied all that together. Finally, really, just the last couple of things. I also worked quite closely with both the Health and Social Care Board and the trusts, and have started discussions with the Education Authority. I also have quarterly meetings with Nikki. You'd be glad to know Cilla's probably tired of looking at me. I think that's the right relationship we should have. We try and listen and certainly drive things forward. I hope this demonstrates for you the linkage and the relevance between the cycle of reporting on children's rights and the ongoing mechanisms and work that's embedded in my unit. Thank you.
And I'll just say finally, Chair, that the UK is due to submit the final report to the UN on the 1st of March. You may well be aware that they're very restricted in terms of the amount or the number of words, indeed, that they can submit in that report. And that causes difficulty, obviously, for all jurisdictions. But very helpfully, the list of issues, number 1 on the list of issues, actually has requested that the responses need to reflect information from all of the jurisdictions where relevant. And we're assured by Department for Education in England that each issue will have a Northern Ireland response where appropriate. So obviously the report can't fully reflect all that we would want it to reflect, but it's important to remember this is only one part of the process. The oral examination in May will be a very important opportunity for officials to discuss the position in more detail, and we will have at least 2 representatives from Northern Ireland as part of the delegation with the rest of the UK, and we will also have a process in place then here to ensure that those officials or the officials can be on standby to provide additional support to them. So we're very happy to take any questions you have.
Good. Well, perhaps we could begin with the child poverty strategy and an update of where you are with bringing that forward.
Child poverty is not one of my areas now, but I'm aware that the committee has written to the department for an update, and my understanding was that a response had been issued. I think that it's to go to the executive, I think, and then they're to provide further information or provide an update.
Yes, I think the response is that it is not agreed by the executive. So, as you know, there's already been a rather embarrassing court case in Belfast over the lack of an anti-poverty strategy. Do you fear that the UNCRC, when they report after they've looked at the list of issues, there will be another very embarrassing condemnation over the lack of a child poverty strategy?
Well, I would hope that the child poverty strategy could be published as soon as possible. I mean, as I say, I'm not really the person to be able to describe or to explain in any detail what the issues are with the strategy. All I do know is that it is hopefully for executive, or it'll be it'll need to go to the executive for approval before it can be published.
You're saying we really, and we will write to the department about whether these Article 24 reports have been laid before the Assembly, but what I think is beyond dispute is that there has been no response since 2007. Well, why wouldn't you respond?
Well, I can give you an update, certainly from 2013. What happened prior to that in 2007 would have been a different mandate indeed at that time.
Well, that doesn't absolve the department. I remember when somebody was appointed head of the Invest NI, they had to go to the Public Accounts Committee for something that happened years ago. I'm
not absolving any responsibility for that. What I can tell you is what we have done. The last report, the second report that came in from Patricia Loosely-Mooney, who was the then Commissioner, we have been taking work forward on that. We have received, obviously, Cilla's agreement to what was in that report. We have shared that with our solicitors. We are actually meeting solicitors. In fact, I think it's later this week. We have a meeting with solicitors to go through all of the issues that has been requested, where the legislation has been requested a change. So, I would be very hopeful that we would be able to, we'd be in a position to put proposals in to ministers based on what the legal advice is in relation to the review. I mean, yes, the review of the legislation has been, on our table for a number of years now. We have tried to progress it, in recent months, certainly, as far as we could, and it's simply, and I'll be honest, in light of other priorities and other resource issues, I mean, that was simply why it hasn't moved as fast as we would like it to have moved.
Is that a good message for any child or young person listening into this committee? In light of other priorities, you're not near the top?
Well, I mean, I certainly don't mean to suggest to children or young people that they're not a priority in any of this.
But you just said in light of other priorities.
Yeah, but
For children and young people.
For children and young people, the other priorities for children and young people throughout the course of the last year were obviously the Children and Young People's Cooperation Act, and indeed the work that we've begun now on the Children and Young People's Strategy. But, we are trying to move things forward. I do appreciate that it has been a long time, and it's been, it is a long time since the second report came in, but we are trying to move it forward.
Alex Maskey.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Margaret, and for your presentation. And wanted to kind of ask a question, a wee bit of, see if there's any flexibility in terms of negotiating what the state may put in, because obviously you're saying there's a limitation to what you can actually get into the report. Would there have been any sense of trying to work out just what kind of priorities would you might want to focus on? Or would Nicky or whatever, somebody else, making these arguments? But, in other words, go and have a negotiation, if that's not too strong a word, but, if you know what I mean, to try and influence the best we could do what we think are the priorities that the state's response should be in relation to children's issues here. You're directly responsible.
Well, yes, we do get a draft copy of the report where we can. Sorry, John, you've done it just.
Yeah, I've been across to England and engaged quite extensively with the people who are pulling the report together, as have my colleagues in Scotland and Wales. So we've made it very clear that the report, we would like it to be representative of the UK position, and where there are particular issues in Northern Ireland or Scotland that should be expressed, we sought that to happen. It's a new team who are drafting it this year, as opposed to the team who drafted the May 2014 report. And they have, as far as I can see, attempted to headline very much the 4 jurisdictions and give as much weight as possible to the key points. So I hope that begins to address your question. We certainly have done all we can to influence that. They, in turn, wrote to the UN and sought more space, because really it amounts to 10,700 words, and that's nothing. It comes down to, 2,000 words each, if you look at the overseas territories. But they have done their best to get the key headline issues there.
Can I just maybe add to that and say that then that's where the examination in May is quite critical, where officials will be able to put across in much more detail some of the issues that have been raised, or progress, or indeed what the plans are to the issues that have been raised. So that's a very critical part of it.
And could I just kind of ask, because this is the more tricky end of this, because presuming that you're not conservative or risk averse or anything like that, you'd want to get the best job done as an official. So a wee bit of a conflict and tension that you're going to have, because obviously, as already been said early on, all these issues are politically agreed to or not, as the case might be. So, and certainly where we're feeling, I'd want the UN and anybody else to be coming wrapping us over the knuckles. So how do you do a report? How do you, maybe you might not be able to answer this, but trying to work out how do you do a report which is actually saying here's what we're doing, but here's also what we're not doing. You know what I mean? Is there any way of squaring that circle just so that there's an honest and frank response from here, if you know what I mean, for inclusion in the state report?
Well, of course,
I know it's a difficult one to.
Any report that goes from here obviously is it's a joint, it's agreed on a joint basis. So it's factually correct in terms of exactly what is being done. Now it's more when officials attend the examination in May then, and it's the oral briefing that's provided then that officials will take and it'll primarily be those officials that have the most number of issues on the list of issues that will be there. So it's more likely to be DOJ, DHSS, and probably education and ourselves. So, I mean, they need to obviously have the departmental lines from their own ministers with them at that stage. So, I think there is there's opportunities for them to be able to provide updates on what they need to do and what they recognise they need to do as a department, and that we would hope that they will be in a position to do that.
And if there's a current review from, say, for example, Nikki, just using that as an example, or they're taking a different view of what the department actually are saying, and that was articulated here earlier today as well. Is there any prospect of having any of that included in the report?
Well, I mean, Nikki will have already provided, in our report, you mean? Well, no, we provide the report on a factual basis in terms of what we're doing in relation to all of the list of issues. The committee itself then has, the report from Nikki and from the alternative report from the other NGOs. So they, will decide, looking at both, what their concluding observations then need to be.
I think Kula did allude that she would be responding once it's published, so there's an opportunity there. I think the fact that Nikki and the NGOs, that their reports are also sought by the committee, balances it and actually gives it a picture, as it should be.
Okay, thank you.
Kula was very clear about the issues as she saw them: academic selection, the legacy that troubles the mental health on young people. Can you give us an equally sort of concise breakdown of the big issues as you see them?
Well, I mean, all of the issues within the report, bar one or two reserved issues, will clearly have a response and will require a response from Northern Ireland. There's about 6 issues, I think, that were very specific, that the list of issues alluded to. That was in relation, of course, to the independence of the commissioners. I mean, that was for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Obviously, the age GFS legislation and the consultation, which excluded under 16s. Youth Parliament not being established in Northern Ireland is very clearly an issue. And the lowering the voting age to under 16s. Ending segregation in education in schools was another one. And then information on progress made in raising the minimum age of criminal responsibilities. So these are more specific to Northern Ireland, but all of the entire 22, 24 issues that were raised will all have an input from Northern Ireland.
Who's responsible for establishing a youth parliament?
Sorry.
Go ahead,
June.
No, sorry. No. We did have good news to tell about that. I was quite hopeful. We have actually been engaging with the Northern Ireland Assembly themselves to take a youth assembly forward. But unfortunately, budgetary constraints have limited that progress. But what I can say is that the Department of Education actually fund 18 young people from Northern Ireland to attend the UK Youth Parliament. So while not fully accepting that it's not the Northern Ireland Assembly, I think that we're certainly going in the right direction, that 18 people from Northern Ireland, from a big diversity of sort of backgrounds, can present the views to the UK. The councils in Northern Ireland, the new district councils, I know, are very much committed to bringing forward youth panels, and I've been talking to them about that, and I'm hoping that that in itself will again draw momentum. So we're working towards what I hope will be a youth assembly of the future. One other success that I think has to be praised was that the Youth Forum in Northern Ireland actually held a youth congress in the assembly in November, which the Speaker chaired the debate, and they spoke very well, I think. And certainly I was writing things down, and that's forming me feedback on their views, back to their views. So we haven't got there yet, but we're working on it.
Was that the one where they had 5 debates?
Yes, yes.
And mental health came out as by far the most important. Yeah, I thought that was very impressive. Would you wish to say anything about the Commission's views on consultation on age discrimination? and the fact that, and these are not the Commissioner's words, these are my words, that the dice was loaded?
Oh, well, other than to say, I mean, we were charged with taking forward a consultation document, and we did that. We did a consultation as far as we could. You know, there was a question around scope of the legislation, which allowed people to provide their views on the entire scope, including whether or not children under 16 were included. And as we said the last time we were at the Committee on Aged DFS, actually people did put their views forward. They very clearly put their views forward on that.
Would you agree with contention that the consultation made it difficult to argue to extend protections to under 16s?
Well, certainly not from the range of comments that we received and the number of comments we received on that particular issue, because that probably was the one issue that we got more comments from than on any other issue. So in that regard...
Indeed. And those comments by and large were in favour of extending?
They were, yes.
To under 16s, yes indeed. Alex Atwood.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there's bad news coming from the UN. I think that's what we can probably conclude. And in one way, I think we're in a phase of politics that because government is so stale in so many places, more external accountability and legal challenge there is to government, maybe that's for the best. And I think that citizens and communities will be going to court more in order to challenge what government isn't doing or is doing, and similarly more external accountability through the UN or other mechanisms. I think the better it'll be for liberating our politics once again. But I do think there's bad news coming from the UN, one way or the other, on the far side of all of this. Can I ask you, without necessarily trying to betray your confidences too much, and given the more collective approach to the creation of the PFG, that where there's some indicators that that's not only outcomes based, but you're involving, or there's more involvement of the external world. Can you indicate what is that shaping up like in terms of PFG headlines?
What's that? What in terms of what outcomes have there been? Draft outcomes? Again, I wouldn't be in a position to really give you any update on PFG. I do know, I think that it's either next week or the week after, I think officials are coming to provide an update, but I wouldn't be...
But from your input to the PFG process, what are you identifying as what you're hearing and what needs to be taken forward with a lot more rigour?
Absolutely. I mean, Jean, you've had those discussions with...
Certainly the Children and Young People Strategy, through the Act itself, that's the tool that I'm hoping both the public and can hold the executive to account on the strategy. So we have to get the strategy right, and I would very much want a specific strategic outcome in the programme for government that identifies the Children and Young People Strategy. So that's the linkage, I think. Now, I'm not sure, like Margaret Rose, not directly involved in that work, but from my perspective, that's what I have been saying, that's what I want to see. In whatever fashion, outcomes-based structure that want to do it.
Well, in advice that you're putting into the PFG process, or advice that you're going to give to ministers, or both, are you saying that Nikki should have the powers that it is seeking, and that should be a legislative commitment to the next PFG?
Well, we can't say that at this stage until we have our discussions with our DSO.
Is that the advice that you're going to give?
Well,
and is that the advice that you're feeding into the officials in OFMDFM who are dealing with the PFG?
But I think it's the outcome will be important. So it's whatever way the outcome is framed, and it'll be around, certainly around children's issues, and this may well be, it could be an action that would form.
Is that the advice that you're giving on the basis of the advice that you've been given? Is that the advice that you're giving? That one way or the other, this issue is once and for all resolved, and that's separate from whatever the UN might say in terms of these bodies answering to the Assembly.
But it's not advice we have given yet, obviously, until we are clear ourselves on what the proposals are likely to be. But you indicate
that you might give advice to ministers in the near future in relation to this? Did you not say that?
Well, yes, well, absolutely, but we need to have our conversations with our departmental solicitors before that, which I think are towards the end of this week.
The advice would be in the nature of pros and cons, the advantages of this recommendation, the disadvantages of this recommendation. So we would give as full a picture as we can, providing the right legal balance to it, so that we're not giving the wrong advice. But then it would be for ministers to make a decision on it.
Yeah, of course, and in that way, I've a lot of sympathy with you. You know, there are in OFMDFM in the office, there's a collective failure times. At times, it's the failure of one or the other. I appreciate you working in a difficult environment, but you're not going to give advice to FM and DFM or the junior ministers that whatever the lawyers are saying, and God knows the lawyers will capture if they can. Are you not going to be saying, no, look, just go over the wall in this one, give them the powers that they need?
Well, obviously, we can't say that at this point. We will certainly be giving them advice with proposals and perhaps options.
They don't want us to give them a recommendation on whether to go over the wall or not. They want us to give us the fullest options, and that's what we'll do.
Well, there's ways of writing these things that can point in certain directions, and I hope you do. Let's ask you another question. In terms of anti-poverty strategy and children's poverty, again, not to put words in your mouth, are you bringing to the attention of ministers the catastrophic situation that we're facing for all the reasons that we know of and all the indicators of where child poverty is going to be come 2020? Is the official system saying to the ministers, this is a monumental, catastrophic situation that we're about to face?
Well, yes, I would expect that the officials dealing with that, have been briefing ministers on, what the data is telling us at this stage. Again, I'm not party to what's actually in that. I haven't been part of those discussions, but yes, of course, our officials will be briefing them on it. Have you anything more to say?
No, that's all we can say. Unfortunately, we don't have the answer to that. We're not the officials.
I don't appreciate that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think that brings us to a conclusion. Of Christine, June and Margaret Rowe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed. Members, there's one other matter just to draw your attention to rather than to discuss today, which is our legacy report. And there is a first draft in table papers beginning at page 13. And as you know, this is largely a retrospective and reflective look back at the work of this committee, but it also includes a short commentary on issues we might want to commend to the next committee of the Executive Office. So in terms of the retrospective piece, there's a lot to it. I mean, in terms of bills, we've had NIPSO, we've also had a short bill on the Ombudsman and Commissioner for Complaints Amendment. A couple of inquiries, TBUC and Barroso, legislation, the inquiry into the Historical Institutional Abuse Bill, Children's Services Cooperation Bill, a lot of policy scrutiny and legislative consent motions. So actually, without spinning or blowing our own trumpets or self-praise, we've done some good work. I think this year we're the first statutory committee to bring forward a substantive bill with NIPSO. I think we reshaped the HIA inquiry, not least the start date, putting it back to 21 from 1945 and bringing into the remit a small number of people who have been waiting the longest for redress. I think the work on victims and survivors, particularly the service, was pretty transformative. And who will forget our work on the legislative consent motion on the Antarctic Bill? Possibly a highlight of this or any mandate of the Northern Ireland Assembly. And then in terms of what we want to commend to the next mandate, there's all sorts from timely receipt of papers through to historical institutional abuse, age discrimination and the rest. So I just alerted to members because I think Cathy probably wants agreement next week or a debate next week.
Probably looking at it in a bit more detail next week. I think it would definitely need to be agreed by the 9th at the very latest, I would imagine. So if there were any comments in the meantime, I'd welcome them, particularly since there's been a change of clerk throughout the course of this mandate, and it would be useful to have input from yourselves as well.
Thank you. So anything glaring that you want, that isn't in, you want in, or anything indeed that you'd rather was toned down or taken out? Okay. Any other business, members? If not, we are adjourned until Wednesday the 2nd of March, 2 p.m. here in room 30. Thank you.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room.